We're going live,
Thank you.
and people will be able to listen and watch. So excited to be here today with Dr. Laszlo Boros, and we're going to talk about deuterium and how important deuterium depletion is, and why carnivore is so important to reducing the heavy hydrogen or deuterium. So, Dr. Boros, welcome, and how are you doing this day?
Thank you so much, Dr. Kiltz, and I just want to thank you for all the work that you do as a clinician. I have to say that you lead this planet in the sense that you use this knowledge in many different medical applications. I'm doing great and looking forward to the conversation with you.
Well, I've been listening and watching you, and Esther's been sharing with us at the 5 a.m., so really excited to have her with us. And Dr. Chafee, I see, has joined us. I don't know if he's still live, but it's great to have people around the globe. Maybe you could just share a little bit about deuterium and exactly what it is and why it's so important to know more about it in our health and wellness.
Well, you know that, and we covered this in our previous talks, but protons or hydrogens are the ping-pong balls of life, meaning that this is how energy is transferred from one substrate to another. And this is how water is generated in our mitochondria. In the meantime, there is ATP or adenosine triphosphate produced that is the energy carrying molecule in our cells. Now, what is really important is that to understand that this hydrogen has a sibling or a twin brother, which is not as similar as we would expect from twins. It's actually twice as heavy and twice as large, and it can sneak into all kind of molecular and metabolic processes that our cells are performing with hydrogen. And those are mostly related to energy production. The main problem is, although that there is a place to filter out deuterium, is that, and this is basically biochemistry related knowledge, the main problem with deuterium is once it gets into proteins or machines or nanomotors in our mitochondria, it may damage or it may even destroy these very delicate proteins. Any protein that works or changes its structure in our mitochondria, they are very sensitive to the level or the concentration of deuterium, and simply because of its atomic structure, having an extra neutron or having a neutron with the proton, it makes it twice as heavy. It makes it like an SUV in a small, like medieval street of like an ancient European city. So it just will not fit. So practically all processes that come to biochemistry or submolecular sciences, they all have a certain way of discriminating hydrogen or protons from deuterium. And for that matter, I think after all, to understand this process or understanding these processes would give a great tool to the hands of clinicians, especially who want to understand biochemistry or metabolism in general terms, to the benefit of certain clinical scenarios and for certain clinical problems. Obesity, diabetes, cancer, neurodegenerative diseases, you name it, practically all chronic medical issues or problems, or even fertility, which is your specialty in the clinical setting, would benefit from Deutenomics or submolecular medical sciences. This is the title of the course at the Vrij University where we actually teach this science. And we are planning to use this basic knowledge of biochemistry, how protons or hydrogens are discriminated from deuterium, the twice as heavy stable isotope of hydrogen, in biology and placed in connective tissues where actually deuterium or heavy hydrogen is needed for strength, flexibility, durability, and so on. And I'm talking about collagen, which is the bone's protein to make bone structures more durable, more flexible. So for those general terms, as metabolism is concerned, it's very important to understand how these substrates, for example, fatty acids and carbohydrates or sugars, are metabolized and compete for metabolism. For that matter, how they compromise one another or each other as far as breaking down and completely oxidizing these substrates. And also, if deuterium is deposited into nucleic acid, how it would affect the phenotype or the biological behavior of these cells. And for that matter, any update to the field of deuteronomics, so on, I think would be very useful for clinicians. And for that matter, the work that you do, especially from the nutritional point and the lifestyle and exercise, so on, would be very useful in the long run in medicine or translational clinical work.
Deuterium is part of the universe.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And so all of us have some deuterium, even if we're strictly carnivore. Is our drinking deuterium depleted water? Is it always going to be there in some amount, but there's sort of a little bit of a competition?
Well, it is a very interesting topic as you bring it up. So let me explain this a little bit more so we understand the role of deuterium in these processes. Yes, indeed, as you said, deuterium is part of the matter that composes us and also part of universe. On Earth, the deuterium is about 0.015%. So it's not a very common isotope. It's not a very frequent stable isotope. It's very rare, but because of its weight, because of its size, atomic size, it's very damaging to biological systems. And it's practically the only isotope in nature that has such a dramatic difference from its parent isotope. Hydrogen and deuterium, they are differ by twice now, as far as their size and their weight is concerned. Now, this low amount of deuterium, once it gets into your system, because hydrogen is used so intensely, sooner or later, it doesn't matter how rare it is, it will hit a very critical protein, I would say, that is participating in energy production, for example, and that could damage those proteins, and those proteins are needed for normal cellular functions. And the carnivore lifestyle is very important, especially if the animals are grass-fed or live in their natural habitat, simply because their fat contain very low deuterium compared to animals that are farm-based, meaning that they are eating grains and so on, which is not their natural food, which is mostly sugar. When we put the cows on a sugar-based diet in the form of corn or grains, they start collecting deuterium in their fat. And also, if we eat sugar or we eat carbohydrates, they in general have higher concentrations of these heavy isotopes. So our body, as through biochemistry, is trying to separate these two isotopes. Sooner or later, they run out of resources of separating or accumulating deuterium at special places or get rid of it. So they start damaging our nanomotors, our mitochondrial nanomotors. And sugars have about 150 parts per million deuterium. That means that among or in about 1 million hydrogen, there are 150 deuterium isotopes. But in the meantime, when you look at fat, it's only 110 or 105 or even lower ppm or parts per million in those substrates. And I just want to point out that there's a new paper published by Dr. Shomyai. They actually published the deuterium content of certain foods or food items, which is really important to trace or look at, simply because it shows the great difference of deuterium content between among carbohydrates, proteins, and saturated fat or plant fat. And those are all lower. And this paper just has been published recently. We did write a few comments about this paper from the Vrije Universiteit when the paper was in the review process and called a preprint. And we're going to transfer those comments to the published paper as well, because this work goes back almost 10 years now. That's where we started working with Dr. Shomyai on food-based deuterium content as the source of metabolic water, because metabolic water is part of our mitochondrial functions, and mitochondrial functions improve our water production from low deuterium fat if we eat the right carnivore saturated animal fat diet, and those animals happen to be eating grass-fed kind of nutrition or graze, and they are pasture raised. So for that matter, it's very important to know the difference between food items of how much deuterium they contain. And now there is a paper that you can have a good idea or a great kind of overview of how food and food items may be different in their deuterium content, and what to put in your mouth after all. Because truly, when I eat my lunch or dinner, I always think of what would happen to my nanomotors who process protons from that food. And for that matter, it's very important to know the deuterium content of the food, and that has to be a carnivore, natural grass-fed fat source and meat source, simply because that has the lowest deuterium and the best biological distribution pattern for it, for our body to and our cells to separate them.
So in essence, the molecules of the food we eat, ultimately on the hydrogen level, the carbon level, the nitrogen level, and all of these are essentially atomic particles that contain energy, and the deuterium has an energy level that is detrimental to us compared to lower molecular weight hydrogen.
Yeah, it is actually heavy and big, large at the atomic scale. It's too heavy and it's too large to be moved through membranes or to be incorporated into proteins that actually rotate and move protons around. It's like practically you can't really park a tractor trailer in your garage, or you cannot really park certain, large cars in a small parking space. So that's practically how deuterium, and the difference is large. It's twice as, if you look at carbons and carbon stable isotopes, those are only 8% larger than their natural parent isotopes. So at the atomic scale, yes, it is a huge deal.
And nothing is still, right? So ultimately, that's maybe the part that we don't, we think that things are just sitting there, but on the atomic level, everything is vibrating. And
that's right.
That vibrational energy, just like the atomic bomb, the breaking of these bonds releases energy. And so the energy could be detrimental, and basically saying that the deuterium hydrogen is likely responsible for the damage we see from cancer, diabetes, stroke, hypertension. I mean, really all of our diseases are related to, we know, a high carbohydrate diet and the carbohydrates tend to have a high deuterium level, and yet but animals like ruminants eat the carbohydrates. There's certainly, even in the grass-fed, there's more deuterium, but they're able to handle that. Would that explain?
Yeah, well, here comes the trick, and I think after all, if you understand how plant-based sugars or substrates are turned into animal fat, then you will understand and you will be able to kind of comprehend why it's so important to have a carnivore grass-fed source kind of lifestyle. It's practically fatty acid synthesis can only happen at the substrate level in the mitochondria in animals. And that means actually animal fat is always low in deuterium because citric acid, which is the citric part of the citric acid cycle, the Saint-Jean-Krebs cycle. I don't want to go into details because that's where we usually lose audience, but practically what you need to know about fatty acid synthesis, it can only happen from citric acid, and citric acid, production of citric acid is only available in mammalian cells in the mitochondria. So it uses deuterium depleted or deuterium free water, the citrate production, and this citrate is the source of malonyl coenzyme A, which is the source of fatty acid synthesis. So any animal that eats grass or their natural food, they've synthesized their fat through their mitochondria, and those mitochondria have no deuterium or low deuterium water to produce the fatty acid precursors. For that matter, animals that are eating their natural habitat and natural food, in their natural habitat, their natural food, they always have low deuterium fat, which we eating, after eating, we turn into low deuterium mitochondrial water. And that protects our mitochondria and mitochondrial nanomotors to break down. And you're right, this happens at the atomic level in that sense. If you eat, for example, carbohydrates that are not your natural food, or they are not your food source, then, or you shouldn't eat them, those carry deuterium potentially into the mitochondria that can damage them. The animals that eat those fruits, eat those plants, they turn those substrates into low deuterium long chain saturated fatty acids, which in our system by circulation, they bind to serum proteins, they get into the cell, they bind to carnitine, then they get transferred through the mitochondrial membrane through this carnitine shuttle system. And in the mitochondria, through beta oxidation, they burn down, they completely get oxidized, and they will actually produce low deuterium metabolic water and ATP in the meantime in the most efficient way. In the process, electrons and light have very important roles because they are the smallest energy communicating resonance scales that we can also use and utilize in our mitochondria, and we can use and utilize those in the energy production and the water production process. And because of this difference in carbohydrates and animal fat in their deuterium content, and obviously the microbiome of cows or plant-eating animals come very important in collecting deuterium and producing a fecal matter, which is practically a deuterium bomb, and that's why flies and all insects feed on them, because that's a good source of deuterium that can actually support their proliferation and their propagation and their skeletal or chitin structure, That's practically what animals or plant-eating animals produce for us: low deuterium saturated fat, which we can burn into metabolic water, and they also produce high deuterium fecal matter, or fertilizers for that matter, that help and promote the life of other species and plants. And it's kind of a circulation of, or circling carbons with the half of oxygen, and circling protons or hydrogen with the half of carbons of oxygen, or oxygen, depending on if it's in the fat or in the water form. But practically it's all about protons, and how to preserve and how to deplete deuterium in these substrates, fat or water, to protect our mitochondrial nanomotors.
So a carnivore diet is really a high fat nutrition, not a high protein, because the protein, along with the sugars, have some adverse effects and don't contribute to the
mitochondrial function,
and also the depleted water, the deuterium depletion water production. Because when you're burning, when you're essentially, we convert fatty acids to ATP, H2O, and CO2, and we can't readily convert sugars directly that way without converting them to fat first via the liver. So it's, I guess, evolutionarily, we evolved as we are because we ate a lot of meat and we ate low deuterium fat, essentially.
That's right. And actually, we started with fat. We started with bone marrow. If you look at anthropological data, and you look at 4.3 million years old carnivore skeletons from Ethiopia, for example, and those are big, large plant-eating animals, their bones, their structures, their skulls were broken into, or were opened by tools, meaning that prehistoric men, or very early men, they learned how to eat fat, how to use those carcasses and eat the fat, and that's what we've been eating, or that's what humans or pre-humans were eating for example, for 3.5-4 million years. So, and you're right. This is how we adapted to our environment. Even though we eat proteins, or even though we eat amino acid rich food, it's very important to know that the fat part of meat is what we utilize in the first place through our digestion. And that's why digestion is so important. When we take a bite of anything, those metabolic enzymes or digestive enzymes, for example, amylase in our saliva, and then amylase in the pancreatic juice, and trypsin and chymotrypsin and lipase, they actually break apart all components that our food is made of. All proteins are broken down, and absorption only takes at the atomic or molecular level, meaning that our gut and our gut microbiome is there to destroy all food that we eat and make him into kind of fat, carbohydrate, and amino acid particles that are absorbed and exchanged, as far as their deuterium content goes, with microbiome-based metabolic processes. And for that matter, it's very critical to understand that when we eat meat, the fat part of the meat is what is absorbed in the form of free fatty acids or triglycerides, and amino acids are absorbed as amino acids. And there are two kinds of amino acids, the ketogenic and the glucogenic amino acids, and those are very important to discriminate against deuterium in metabolism. And this is why our liver is so important, because it, after absorption through the portal vein, it actually rearranges our fat or triglycerides or amino acids with the optimal deuterium content for various processes, and then the secondary transport, or I would say after a few rounds, transport in our blood and in our lymph fluid starts based on a very precise selection of substrates and molecules that our cells will be exposed to, our body cells. And the carnivore lifestyle that we have been covering and we have been talking about for so long, to understand the advantage of the carnivore lifestyle is really providing low deuterium free fatty acids for muscle tissue, for heart muscle operations and functions. And that's the best way to protect these tissues, and that's the best way to produce energy, because the high fat content, the saturated animal fat with low deuterium, is the key to our health, after all.
Well, Dr. Laszlo Boros is with us today, and we're talking about deuterium and the importance of depleting your deuterium. And it is a topic that I know when I first listened and learned about this, still it was a difficult to understand. But the more you listen, the more you go to Dr. Laszlo's website, and we'll put a link to this, we'll all better understand how critical it is at a molecular level, at an atomic level. And really the damage is just like radiation, excess radiation from the sun or other particles, the hydrogen, the heavy hydrogen we call deuterium, which primarily comes from a plant-based low animal fat diet, which has really developed so many diseases for us in the last several hundred years, or if not several thousand years. And evolutionarily, we have evolved as humans because fatty meat, and as Dr. Laszlo's mentioned, our ability to get to the bone marrow, I'm sure the brain and some of the organ meats have some importance in that also, Dr. Boros?
Yes, indeed. Well, our meat of the hind steak, what you talk about, steaks for that matter, and the hind steaks, there are actually more that contain more fat, are what animals are eating. Not all steaks are kosher, for example. High protein fat is not, or those kind of high protein containing food is, or muscle is not necessarily beneficial, and those are left for the watchers, meaning that if you look at lions, how they eat, they actually eat the interiors, they eat the omentum, which is nothing but fat practically, and they leave the skin and the high quality, high protein meat sources
The tenderloin.
to the tenderloin. They leave it for the vultures and the hyenas. So,
yes.
And they are smaller in size. They are less. They are very aggressive. They are less, able to catch prey for then on. But the lions, they know what to eat first. They actually that's why they keep the male lion around, because they can actually break a femur bone on a zebra horse, meaning that they can get to their pelvic area, meaning that it's really a fascinating process just to see how the carcass is consumed. And then when the carcass is left there, that's when the prehistoric men came around and learned how to get to the bone marrow, which actually is more important when it comes to deuterium depleted fat. So for that matter, I think deuterium depleted fat as a nutritional item, or as a nutritional kind of food source, was the important element in adapting to the what we know human lifestyle, for that matter. Or if you look at from the creation point of view, this is how humans were created. Practically just eat low deuterium fat and develop their brains, simply because now with less deuterium, they can actually use some of the nanomotors and some of the mitochondrial processes in their brain to produce neurotransmitters. So they could actually observe, they could memorize, they could remember, they could organize more complex social structures. They could actually find different and better, more safe places to live in caves and so on. And they also invented fire, meaning that they learned how to prepare these fat-based food, how to take those bone particles, those long femur bones, for example, into their caves, and how to make stew of those. And after all, they learned very close to Tel Aviv, about 150,000 years ago, cavemen, they actually packed their bone marrow containing bones into, they sawed the skin back on the bone simply just to conserve fat, meaning that now they could actually carry their fat source or bone marrow source with them. So, and if you look at biblical stories, if you look at letters from the Old Testament, then you can see that the Jewish kings, they paid the most for the cartilages and the joint bones to actually supply food to their armed forces, meaning that it was, and it is, the most important element to understand human strength and being able to focus on certain tasks and solve certain tasks that other species are not able to do. And if you go down to the story of Gilead, actually God asked him to take your army people down to the river and watch them how they drink. Army members who actually get down their bellies and start drinking water like crazy, they are not good soldiers. So don't take them. Only take the soldiers that actually only wet their lips. And if you look at a boxing game, you can see in the breaks, they are supposed to spit out the water, meaning that they just rinse. Water and carbohydrates are not for our consumption, only in certain circumstances. It's actually fat, and metabolic water that we produce is the safest way to operate our cells and our system.
So we're drinking too much water. And maybe it's natural, if we have it, we drink it, but it's become our habit that we're drinking way too much. Maybe you could talk a little bit about over consumption of water and things like that.
I think now most of the societies that are kind of exposed to too much bottled water, for that sense, and drink 2-3 liters or 2 gallons of it a day, they live in a disease state called diabetes insipidus, meaning that they don't have ADH or antidiuretic hormone anymore, meaning that their whole physiology is adapted to excessive external water consumption that changes their physiology, and they are actually pushed into a disease state that is practically characterized with plenty of urine or urination because of the excessive water intake, and that requires antidiuretic hormone to be low so they can get rid of the excess water. My understanding or my practice in that sense, that to consume water, is that not to drink water, but to eat water. If I'm thirsty, every morning I have a little coffee. That's what I do. But that's probably 1 or 2 deciliters a day, and I'm done with drinking. Then I would eat a spoonful of Mongolica pork fat, for example. If I'm thirsty, I would eat a little tallow if it's available, if I'm thirsty. And sure enough, it would take your thirst away. If I feel thirsty, I wait a few minutes. I let my antidiuretic hormone to kick in even more and to preserve my very valuable low deuterium metabolic water. And if I'm still thirsty, then I would have a little bit of fat, maybe a spoonful, but that has to be a grass-fed fat source. And if I'm still thirsty, then I would drink only as much water as it is necessary to kill my thirst, and it's usually deuterium depleted water.
So less water, more fat. So when we talk about carnivore, or I eat, there's a lot of talk about high protein, even in the carnivore world, but it really needs to be focused on fat in your food in order to provide more of the water from the fat. And then when you're metabolizing, it's always fat, because if you're an anorexic and you have no fat on your body, survival is short. The same with cachexia or sarcopenia, liver failure, liver damage are all low fat environments on your body.
That's right. That's right.
Detrimental.
That's right.
And
Yeah.
so
Mhm.
ultimately, the idea that we evolved as apes and we should be still eating like an ape, which turns out to be a high plant-based, high deuterium sugar diet, versus more like a lion, which is all the anthropologic data suggest, and the biblical writings really
That's
talk
right.
about the fact that we ate fat, and that's how we became this alpha predator organism of the world.
That's right. If you look at the Old Testament, nobody drinks water with unknown source. If somebody's thirsty, they get actually cream, or they get olive oil, or they get some kind of a fat source to actually replenish their water source. And I find this fascinating that historically, if we go back in anthropology, or even in our scriptures, letters of ancient times,
Yes.
we already have these concepts very strongly cemented in the whole logic of creation and so on, just carrying on human life, meaning that this is a very important basic knowledge going back to ancient Hebrew writings, even before that, rune scripts, meaning that paleo writings, and for example, the Tatar Laka discs have concepts of these, and those are 7,500 years old symbols. That is, it seems like the carnivore lifestyle, the life that you talk about as a clinician, physician who deals with very prominent and contemporary medical issues, is very critical to solve them on a historic scale, meaning that low deuterium animal fat, and not drinking too much water, or even eating carbohydrate at all. Those are very important context to the clinical decision-making process, or to support human well-being and certain physiological processes that are related to human life, for example, fertility and so on. And sure enough, if you look at some of the conversations that we covered with Sarah and with Joy and those other, and Dr. Chafee, we actually covered this simply because this is such an essential part of supporting, for example, fertility. And we have clinical scenarios where we can show that actually some of the medical issues, some of the medical problems that these patients have, they can be fixed, including diabetes, including type 1, type 2 diabetes. And Zsofia Clemens, she talked about her paleolithic ketogenic therapeutic approaches, which are published in the medical literature as peer-reviewed case reports. And you had conversations in the past. I think, after all, understanding the importance of these scriptures, the water and the carbohydrate and the fat consumption patterns, and eat a very simple carnivore lifestyle, you can see clinical improvements in some of those conditions. And sometimes I would love to hear some of your stories about some of these clinical advances based on nutritional and carnivore reasoning in the clinical setting, because I'm sure you have some clinical scenarios that you can share with us as well.
Well, we haven't published them, but we published them online, and the stories are everywhere. And I think the interesting part about science today, social medicine, is social media. There's so much we're sharing to so many more people that have access to these stories. I mean, I learned about this through social media. And both of us were at Harbor UCLA in Los Angeles, and our paths didn't meet. But here we are today with Dr. Chafee, Sophia Clemens, and people, Sean Baker, and people around the globe talking about how carnivore cures so many diseases, and ultimately reproduction. Being infertile is growing in the world. And all cultures around the world are seeing more and more problems with fertility. And I think we can really take it down to the level of a high deuterium damage due to a plant-based low animal fat diet.
And sorry about interrupting you, but this is very, very important what you just said, because I think human infertility is partially caused by the male chromosomes getting too heavy, and when they actually meet with the female chromosomes, which are actually locked in at the first 3 weeks of the fetal life, meaning that deuterium content in a mother's ketosis. That's why we have seen mothers thrown up or have this morning sickness, for that matter, simply because in the first trimester, in the first 3 months of the baby's life, the mothers live in ketosis regardless of what they eat. And that's when the female chromosomes are produced and locked into the ovaries, into the follicles. In the meantime, the male chromosomes are exposed to food. So what we eat, what the deuterium content of our food is, will affect the size and the weight of the male chromosomes. And if they are too heavy because of deuterium overload, they are not able to stay together with the female chromosomes to produce the human genome, for that matter. So those fertilized eggs, they die, and that's why there's low fertility, and this is why we have such a problem with fertility issues.
So there's a natural attraction that's supposed to happen at that level, but there's a repulsion that's likely happening both at the chromosomal, the molecular level, but then we see it at the embryonic implantation or the fertilization level, where they're in contact, but they're not melding together as they're.
They are too heavy. The male chromosomes are too heavy to stay together. It's just that's why the mating fight is so important in ketosis. If you look at wild animals, they have a mating season, and the males, without eating, in very deuterium depleted ketosis, they burn their own fat. They fight each other for mating, meaning that the most able, the lowest in deuterium, the males with the highest rotation of their nanomotors and the biggest strength, muscle strength, are able to mate. And they have the largest ability, or they have the biggest chance to actually fertilize a female egg, simply because the deuterium content in their chromosomes is low.
My friend Dan is a hunter, and he just took down a 6-year old huge buck with these amazing pointed antlers, and but he talks about the fact that they're in their rut, they're not eating, they're just focusing on mating. And so
that's right.
And for women who have nausea and vomiting in early pregnancy, it says, don't put that food in me. you're going to damage this embryo. This implanted embryo requires a ketotic environment, which essentially is a low to no consumed sugars.
That's right.
And
That's
even
right.
the fact of you're not even eating fat, but you're using the fat that you consumed and you developed, because this term being obese is we claim people are obese, and then they're all trying to be skinny, which is actually detrimental in and of itself.
That's right. That's right. It's if you look at the animals, how they behave, especially the males, they either have to fight with other males or they have to dance. And the choreography, the muscle move, the strength of their muscles, that kind of, and that's what the females watch. They don't care about anything else other than the deuterium content of the male chromosome that will actually have the chance to meet with their eggs, low deuterium eggs. And that's why this whole biological behavior, what your friend was telling you, is so critical and important to understand fertility.
What was the idea that muscle, the muscle building world, even in that world, in order to really show off your strength, you actually have to starve yourself. You do all this build up the muscle, and then you starve yourself for the last week, 2 or 3, in order for your muscles to show itself, which is our mating dance. That's all the dance, isn't it?
That's right. That's right. That's practically what females look for. It's not practically biological behaviors are all arranged about deuterium content and in certain species about carnivore lifestyle, simply because predators, the fastest, the most kind of successful, the mentally most able, and teamwork, some of those hunts, they require very sophisticated biological patterns as far as thinking, planning, and speed. And because some of those plant-eating preys are very strong and very fast. So for that matter, species evolve to be able to catch up with them and to actually get to that low deuterium animal fat as efficient as possible. And for that matter, they eat the interiors because those contain the most processed, least deuterium fat source. And this is how they maintain their abilities. And you're right, when you consume food, and I'm talking about humans now, which is high in deuterium, high in sugars, which you should not eat, because you glycosate. Practically, glucose is not for energy production. Glucose is a very, I would say, cumbersome substrate. It's there for biological modifications. When you look at animal fat, that's your high octane fuel to actually supply energy for your Ferrari engine in your mitochondria. And this is why the highest octane fuel can be acquired from saturated animal fat, because those contain the most protons per carbon with the least deuterium.
So plant sugars, glycans, are foreign in general to our diet for thousands, if not millions of years. It's true we can eat them, but they're a large factor in presenting deuterium in larger amounts, which ultimately damage us at the molecular level. The glycosylation becomes glycation, which is the abnormal binding of sugars. The nanomotors are damaged. Glycoprotein, glycolipoproteins are all damaged in the process. And the mitochondria are simply working to make the energy, but there is fat, so you're able to make it. But the deuterium and or the sugars, the plant glycans, are damaging the system, and it doesn't function.
You only need as much sugar as your liver can produce from glycerol of fat. And because gluconeogenesis and hepatic glucose production, you can supply glucose to all peripheral tissues to actually support your glycosylation or glycation patterns in your system. And again, there's because of this diverse deuterium content between carbohydrates and fat, there's a very important element that comes in that is how do you discriminate against protons and deuterium and how to serve certain tissue and protein phenotype related patterns, because connective tissue, clearly, this is what we need to understand. Connective tissue, collagen, proline, and hydroxyproline, they need deuterium for bone strength. And for that matter, some of the most recent data that we saw publishing from the Karolinska Institute by Dr. Zubarev, you can see high deuterium content, how important it is for bone strength of gray seals that are actually phenotypically are living in a very challenging environment. They have to escape killer whales, they have to escape white sharks, great white sharks, while they are hunting for food. So for that matter, deuterium has a role, but it's not in the mitochondria, it's in the connective tissues. Somehow, this whole pattern of dysregulation, there's going to be a great article very soon. It's in the printing process in the Townsend letters that actually going to talk about this dysregulation pattern. And those need to be considered as the most contemporary and the most important. I can't talk about it more simply because it's in the preview and printing process, but practically you're gonna see instead of depleting or accumulating deuterium, now you're gonna see a regulatory pattern that we teach at the Vrije University. It's simply part of submolecular medicine, to be able to pronounce, to be able to emphasize, to be able to clinically and medically position deuteronomics or deuterium biochemistry that includes what you have been covering, Randall cycle, TC cycle, and so on. And for that matter, cancer development, diabetes, type 1, type 2 diabetes, you're going to see how important these patterns are when it comes to explaining human disease and explaining deuterium's behavior and deuterium separation from hydrogen to serve certain phenotype and certain disease processes.
And we're putting a link to LaszloBoros.com where they can find all this information, Dr. Boros?
Some of them are published, yes, indeed. I keep adding those to my website and to communications. Some of them haven't been published yet, but coming out soon. Then you're gonna see those at the due course. But practically, these are the newest updates and developments to deuteronomics, for that matter, and to medicine, in my views, and to human nutrition. And I think, after all, they all have to be included and incorporated into our medical thinking. And after all, I think these conversations with you, Dr. Chaffee, and other investigators and clinicians are very important to settle these issues and give clear biochemical, medical, biochemical deuteronomics reasoning to the carnivore element or carnivore lifestyle that actually, after all, serves our health, not because of some hard to explain reasons, but because of very clear medical, biochemical reasoning.
And the foundation here is simplicity, because hydrogen is the most prolific molecule or atomic in the universe. And so it's the critical component of the human body. And if you have the heavy deuterium too much in your body, it's going to be detrimental. Could you have too little?
Deuterium is practically unnecessary for mitochondrial functions. In certain places, yes, you should have no deuterium whatsoever. So again, it can be too little to support certain processes like cell proliferation and so on. Nothing grows beyond 40 ppm, for example. You can kill bacterial cultures without deuterium. That's or they have to go through a certain adaptation process to obtain deuterium. In collagen and in connective tissues, you have to have certain amount of deuterium to actually have bone strength and flexibility. For example, gingival diseases and connective tissue and bone collagen are very sensitive to vitamin C content, which is one of the cofactors in hydroxyproline synthesis. And this is how our bones accumulate deuterium. But in fact, deuterium has no place in certain biological processes in certain cell compartments, but it has very important roles in providing structural elements. It's more like a building block. You can't really build a house without strong building blocks, but they are not really designed for your pipe system, meaning that the structure and the moving parts are very different in handling deuterium, and to separate those, to regulate those, I think those are the most important advantages of medicine that is coming out.
So the amount of deuterium in our bone structure?
Yeah, in collagen, proline and hydroxyproline, these two amino acids accumulate deuterium, and 20 to 30% of collagen is made of these amino acids, and those can accumulate deuterium and provide bone strength in certain species that are challenged in the phenotype scale, meaning that they either have to do high-speed dives in the air, or they have to go up and down in oceans while they are escaping predators, and those have to be their bones have to be designed in different ways, accumulating deuterium. In collagen, understanding this process, which is the regulation and dysregulation process of deuterium biochemistry, those are very critical to understand phenotype, and for that matter, disease and health.
I look so much at glycosylation and the glycobiome, which ultimately, it seems to me, much of our damage is due to the foreign plant sugars, the glycans, which are damaging us due to the chemicals but it's high deuterium. That seems to me the simple answer. Eat the fatty meat, the organs with the omentum and all the fat, which is such an important thing. And that high fat nutrition suppresses inflammation, and it removes the toxic deuterium filled plant glycans, essentially.
That's right. After all, if you look at the lions, how they eat, they actually open up the carcass. They actually eat the interiors first, and they let the youngsters to eat the best parts, which is the omentum and the fat-containing interiors, and that's how they keep their health and strength and social structures and their ability to catch prey.
You had mentioned I'm just curious about any of the plant oils like olive oil, coconut oil, or avocado. Any of the oils from plants are lower in deuterium compared to
somewhat lower, but not as low as animal fat. If you look at Dr. Shomia's paper, which is already published, then you can see those food items and their deuterium content, and there you can actually see how olive oil compares to animal fat. There is I think olive oil is 130 ppm and animal fat is 110 ppm. So there's a large difference in their deuterium content.
And that paper is linked on your website?
I'm not sure if I linked it already because it only got published a few weeks ago.
Okay.
It was in a preprint format that I shared on my social media, but you can find it. I send it to you and we can share it with the stock.
We'll put the link up there because this is such important information because
It is. It
we
is.
need the simplification. And deuterium really is not a difficult concept to understand because we know about hydrogen atoms and carbon atoms and all of these are and oxygen are very important. And we all have the ability to listen and learn and take control of our health and wellness in a simple way. And
Well, that's right. And sorry about the interruption.
please,
We can ask Dr. Chaffee to as a quarterback, what happened if somebody gave him a twice as heavy football? I'm sure the whole game would have fallen apart. And that's what deuterium does in our biological system. There's a quarterback there's a nanomotor that has to throw the protons into the mitochondrial matrix, and if it's a twice as heavy bar, it's not going to go that far. If it's twice as large, it's not going to fit. If it's really not the right proton, for that matter, if it's not the right bar, and we are not talking about slightly different way. We are talking about twice as heavy, twice as large as far as atomic structures go, and this is what the name of this whole trick.
the nanomotors that are part of the electron transport chain, I mean, that's a major component of what we're talking about, because if the hydrogen atoms that are being pushed through that, the electrons are heavy, it's going to bind up the system, it's going to slow down, and or it's going to die. You're going to reduce the number of mitochondria in the cell, which adversely affects the cell, the organ, and the organism. And that's probably all of our medical problems in a simplistic way.
Yeah. So, and this is why understanding what you have been covering for almost about a year, as far as carnivore lifestyle, and how important it is to consume animal fat and burn oxidized animal fat instead of anything else. That's what the fat is so important. Simply, if it's low deuterium, that provides metabolic water and electrons. When you do a head count of protons and electrons, it has to be depleted to make this chemical process come together. After all, that we know ATP synthesis and metabolic water production. And the key to this, to understand how low deuterium saturated animal fat can serve this process the most optimal way.
So obviously, free range, grass fed is better when you're eating the ruminant animal. But obviously, even a grain fed is a start for people that are moving from a plant based to an animal based diet, and focus on the fat, not the protein. That
That's right.
and the bone marrow, that'll help tremendously.
That's right. That's the key. That's the name of the game. You got it.
And Dr. Chaffee confirms that he only worked with the lightest footballs, but I bet at the time he thought, wow, this is a little heavy and hard at times.
It's interesting because one of the quarterbacks, they had this little thingy in the gloves just to let some air out of the ball. Meaning that if you change the weight of the ball, even just slightly, you have a different game. Yeah. I think one of the I don't recall who that was, but a few years ago, there was a big deal about this. Now, you can imagine when this ball changes its weight by a factor of 2, that or twice as heavy or twice as large. That's a very different game. And for that matter, in the nanomotors, the same rules apply, and after all, our health is best served by protons and not deuterons, as long as moving protein parts are. And you're right, it has to be very simple, And I think this is very simple to understand. When you have a rotating protein, that has to have the optimal fuel, and that's low deuterium fat-based proton source to produce sufficient amount of water.
And ultimately, plant sugars are deadly. And if I can get my animal fat,
now that's what we're talking about.
This is the critical part for all of us. So
you can see how much more wide bars you have in the protons, and how how important it is to have how important it is to have carbons and hydrogen. Or
they're not all. I'm missing some of them on here, but it's very critical and important.
And the carbohydrates have a lot more of. I have a piece of pork fat here. You can see the white, wet, kind of moisty, juicy fat part, and that's what the low deuterium water source is. The rest is for the glycogenic and ketogenic amino acids, and the proteins are for gut bacteria and for some structural elements. But the most important part of this energy source is this high fat, low deuterium containing saturated fat that is produced in an animal that produces this fat in their mitochondria with deuterium-free water. Once we reoxidize this fat into metabolic water, while we produce ATP energy with the help of oxygen that is in the air, that's what's the key to understand human health. And that's why we have to eat this carnivore fat type of lifestyle, in fact.
Dr. Laszlo G. Boros, thank you so much for being with us. We're going to do this again. It's a great conversation to keep us all learning. And life is full of learning, and we have to keep on doing it. And so grateful for you. Keep on sharing this great, amazing energy and ideas.
Thank you for your work also, Dr. Kiltz. We as doctors and clinicians, I think I do teach this. I don't do clinical work, but I love working with clinicians who are incorporating this knowledge in their practices.
Well, and what I'm finding is our patients, our clients, are really they want to hear this. They want to learn themselves. They want to know the basics so they can take control of their health and wellness. And that the science is critical to help us clinicians understand the process of a healthy human being.
Yeah, and indeed, we have to do this over and over, because unfortunately, as simple it is for us, may be a little bit more difficult for others. And the way we can actually take him down the garden path is just to take a slow walk.
And I think the repetition, as we keep on, like you showed the fatty meat there, it's this is it, right? This is so critical and important. And
this is it.
Yeah.
That's it.
All right, I'm getting to my clinical day. You're ending the. Let's see, you're a little later in the morning, but have an awesome day, my friend. And to Esther, thank you to her. All right, I'll see you.
Thank you so much.
All right,
have a good day.
Thank you. Bye. Thanks everyone for joining another great 5 a.m. meetup, this time with Dr. Laszlo G. Boros on deuterium and how important it is to focus on fat as our food and lean meat rarely. And you don't have to drink as much water, but you want to deplete the deuterium so you can move more freely and keep passing the ball around. God bless. Have an awesome, amazing day, my friends. Take care.